My name is Oriana Peñaranda.
My name is Monica Geary.
And I'm Daniel Sweeney. Thank you all so much for coming to our capstone project tonight, entitled Gender Integration in the Colombian Natural Resources Sector. So for our client, we had somewhat of a hybrid situation going. So our primary client was the Inter-American Development Bank. For those who don't know, the IDB is kind of a counterpart somewhat to the World Bank in that it's a multilateral development bank, but it focuses primarily on the Western Hemisphere. We also worked with a series of other implementing partners on the project that we were examining, primarily Jaime Arteaga y Asociados, the Chamber of Commerce of Medellin for Antioquia, and Vamos Mujer y Sierra. Vamos Mujer and Sierra are actually two organizations that work very closely together. We'll talk a little bit more of those two in a minute. We spent our time in Bogota and Medellin in Colombia. We provided some gender integration and theory of change workshops, as well as conducted some key informant interviews. So specifically, what we were looking at was the Canadian Extractive Sector Facility, which is a $20 million grant that was given to the IDB in 2016 to focus on a number of natural resources sector projects throughout Latin America. Specifically, we were looking at one very important one in Colombia, in the small little municipality of Buritica, which is this little red dot here, which is inside the Antioquia district. And if you look up here, you will see where the Antioquia district is in the rest of Colombia. Buritica is blessed in some ways in that it has a very high gold reserve, which is not something that's totally uncommon to Colombia or South America in general, and that's great, but it also can have some counter problems, namely that there is a high volume of illegal mining in Buritica. And a few years ago, that became a great security issue for the Colombian government to come in, remove a lot of this illegal mining. Haven't gotten all the way there, but they've done a lot of that. With illegal mining comes a lot of other various issues as well, namely gender-based violence. It's not something that's becomes pretty common. The kind of flip side to that is once you're done removing some of the illegal mining is you need to create a development project, right, by which to create a more sustainable and resilient society. And that's where Plan Buritica comes in, which is led primarily by Jaime Arteaga, JANA, but also has a variety of implementing partners as well, Vamos Mujer y Sierra, and the Antioquia Chamber of Commerce. So we were specifically looking at their programming as it relates to women's economic, political, and social empowerment. And our job, sort of as defined by the IDB, we were going to go in and we were going to look at how have they implemented gender so far, and what the gaps were, and then we were also going to conduct some workshops on how to fulfill that. So a little bit in the way of roadmap. Monica will talk a little bit about those workshops that we did. Oriana will speak a little bit more to some of our key findings, and finally Cecilia will conclude by talking about some of our recommendations.
Right, so as Danny mentioned, we facilitated a couple gender integration workshops. These were facilitated for Jaime Arteaga y Asociados and the Chamber of Commerce in Medellin for Antioquia. The workshop topics covered gender terms and concepts, so this was gender analysis, what is gender versus sex, what are gender-based constraints. We also talked about the gender integration continuum, and for those of you who don't know what that is, this is a continuum that was developed by the Interagency Gender Working Group, and it basically divides programming into gender blind and gender aware, and then gender aware is a continuum from gender exploitative to gender transformative, which is ultimately the goal because you're transforming gender norms. And then we also talked about gender and what it looks like in the natural resources sector. So what are typical gender-related barriers? What does gender look like in this sector? And we also gave recommendations for how these implementers can integrate gender in their future programming. And these recommendations were broadly created from conversations that we had with these implementers before we went to the field, and then also before we gave these workshops. And then our workshops also included a pre and post assessment so that we could gauge how well we facilitated these workshops. So an example of something that we used in our workshop was a participatory method where we presented a series of cartoons and we led discussions about what the cartoons meant and how they looked like to these specific implementers in their programming. So we had them look at these cartoons and see what is the cartoon trying to convey, have they seen this in the context of their programming, and how could integrating gender improve this issue? So these are only a couple of the ones that we used, but the top one is the businessman is talking to the husband, who's assumed to be the head of household, and he's basically selling his land even though he's not working on it, and the women are. And then the bottom one, you see that both the husband and the wife come from the same job in the mine, but the woman has to do a double work day and work with their children. So this was basically just to facilitate a conversation with the implementers and really get talking about what are the issues that they're seeing in their programming. And then our assessments, so due to some complications where some people arrived late or had to leave early for other meetings, we only had 6 complete sets of assessments where we had the pre and post data. And some of the results that we found were that respondents demonstrated a better understanding of the difference between sex and gender. And this is a really important basis to understanding why gender integration is important. You see that sex is purely biological, whereas gender is based in social norms, stereotypes, constructs. And so it's really important to address those things moving forward. JANA participants indicated that their programs took gender into account, but the Chamber of Commerce did not. And then as part of our post-assessment, we had a question about what are their key takeaways, and some of the responses were that they understood the importance of integrating gender in all stages, from planning to implementation to monitoring and evaluation. And then they also understood the difference between gender accommodating